Hey, how's it going? I am Boomer Trujillo, and this is another installment of Critical Thinking Basics. So, last video, we talked about words and definitions and kind of how to navigate ambiguity, vagueness, that kind of stuff. This time, what we're going to talk about is arguments. So, whenever we have more than just individual words or phrases, how do we piece those things together? What are some tools that we can use to kind of understand what's going on whenever we're evaluating arguments? So, tonight, basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to define argument, and I'm going to talk especially about maybe some practices that can help us to interpret arguments in better ways or help us to pick our battles and assess what kind of arguments that we run into. Now, the whole class, in a lot of ways, is about arguments and assessing arguments. So, we're not going to get into everything. This is just meant as an overview and a way of defining really fundamental terms that we need. Okay. So, the first thing that we should probably cover is what an argument even is. And so, the sort of core traditional view is again by something like Stan Baronet. This is his logic textbook. This is one of the previous editions, as I referenced in the previous video, and he offers a definition of what I think is kind of taken as the most traditional view of argumentation, and that is this. Arguments are, according to him, quote, an argument is a group of statements, sentences that can be true or false, in which the conclusion is claimed to follow from the premises. A premise is the information intended to provide support for the conclusion, and the conclusion is just the main point of an argument. So basically, what we have in Stan Baronet's definition is that an argument is a collection of statements. These statements can be either true or false. So, what we mean by true or false is called truth aptness. We don't really have to go too much into it. But for example, a sentence that probably isn't truth apt is, um, you know, uh, go get me a coffee. Is the sentence go get me a coffee true or false? Probably not. It seems like it's an imperative. It seems like it's doing something else. Um, or maybe we're just kind of like screeching for joy and saying something in that regard. So we could be using words whenever we're super excited to go to like a concert or something like that. But it doesn't seem like those words are truth apt either. Arguments are especially focused in on situations where we're speaking in sentences that could be true or false. And whenever we have these collections of sentences basically grouped together in the common purpose of proving some point, that's what an argument is. So Baronet says basically arguments have a conclusion, which is the main point that they're trying to get at. And in an argument, those conclusions are going to have some element of support, some sort of information that's going to try to prove those arguments correct or true. So this leads to a traditional view of argumentation. Arguments are about words, right? Arguments are about words. In fact, logic is coming from the Greek word logos, which can refer to words, but also just refer to reasoning. The whole idea of being logical is paying attention to the words, paying attention to the reasons, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about this later. But arguments themselves are about the words. They are not about expressing emotion. They're not about issuing commands, as I previously was saying. Basically, they're not about non-declarative, non-indicative language. So if you remember any of your grammar lessons, declarative meaning like a declarative sentence. It's not an exclamation. It's not a question mark, right? It's like whenever we're speaking straightforward. Moreover, it's not about non-indicative language. So we're not just talking about moods. We're not speaking in subjunctive here necessarily. We're just trying to get to a point. The point is the conclusion. The support is what helps. So arguments have a point, and then the point has support from the premises. Premise just means the support that we're kind of getting at. Now on this slide, I've also included a bunch of indicator words that can kind of help you out. Usually whenever people are using words like therefore, thus, so, consequently, it follows that, we can infer that, this proves or implies or suggests that, those are indications that they're trying to get a conclusion conveyed in what they're talking about. Similarly, premise words have indicator words where they are basically letting you know that they are trying to connect ideas together, probably to a conclusion. And these kind of premise connection words are things like because, since, given or assuming that, as shown or as indicated, it follows from, for that reason. Those kinds of things where you're connecting the ideas, you're showing that these things have relationships to another. That is typically indicating that there's some sort of premise being given in the argument. Now, logic, there's a lot of different types of argumentation, and we could probably talk about one or two others specifically, but the two types of arguments that will almost always come up in a logic class, or especially in a critical thinking class, are deductive and inductive. Deductive arguments are kind of like the classical argument. What I have here on the slide is a picture of what's called the function machine, and that's because deductive logic is very mathematical. The idea is that we have a machine that preserves truth. That's the whole hope of logic. And so if you think of the function machine as the system of logic, we know how to use the rules, and we're not going to get into the rules here, we're just talking about logic. And if we put in true statements as the inputs, then even though the machine might rearrange the parts in certain ways, we know that the machine, if it's working properly, will preserve the truth of anything that we've put into it. And so we get unintuitive or non-obvious things coming out, but because we know that the things that we put in were true, and because we know that the rules that we've set up in logic will basically maintain that truth, they will preserve that truth, we know that the new stuff that comes out the side, and it's new, like we don't know it, right? It's rearranged, it's doing different things, that is also true. It's true because we put true things into it, and the system itself preserves the truth, so the interesting stuff that comes out on the other side is also true. That's the kind of hope of deductive arguments or deductive systems. These are often called top-down systems, in the sense that basically whenever you're talking in a deductive way, you're talking about necessary truths. You're talking about preserving truth. And I think the most quintessential areas where this sort of stuff happens is something like math or geometry. So if you can think back to like geometry class in high school or something like that and having to do proofs, or if you can think about like mathematical definitions, whenever you're talking about that kind of stuff, that stuff just seems necessarily true. Okay? Now we assess deductive arguments in two ways, generally speaking, and these words are really important. The first word gets used in a lot of different ways colloquially or in our common language, but the first thing that we would assess a deductive argument for is called validity. Or we would say that's valid. That's valid in colloquial term. That just means that, it's okay, it's good, you have an okay perspective. But in logic, what validity is it says that the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. Okay? So in other words, if you were to assume that all of the premises in the argument were true, now you don't know if they are at this stage or not, but if you were to assume that all of the premises in the argument are true, the connection between the ideas is so tight that the conclusion would necessarily be true as well. So what validity is basically saying is that the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises, or if all of the premises were true, the truth of the conclusion would be guaranteed in a valid argument. Think of validity as connecting the pieces. You aren't assessing the pieces for truth or falsity. You're just saying, if I grant my opponent whatever they're saying whenever they're giving an argument, these ideas connect together well. So if they connect well, it's a valid argument. If they do not connect well, it is an invalid argument. Now, if we assess an argument, and if we find that it's valid, all of the pieces connect, and they connect in such a deep and fundamental way that necessarily the truth of the conclusion would be guaranteed because of the way the premises connect to it, we can elevate something from being a merely valid argument to being a sound argument. And what a sound argument is it's an argument that's valid, all of the pieces connect, and we've looked at all of the premises, we've looked at all of the pieces, and we've said, yes, those are true statements. So first we test for validity. Does everything even connect in the right way? If it connects in the right way, good, we can move on. And if all of the premises are true, then it's also sound. And the reason why that we don't assess for soundness, at least initially, is if the pieces don't even connect in the right way, then the argument doesn't work. We're only interested in the pieces or the premises being true if the connections work. So first we test for connections, and then we test for truth of the individual parts of the argument. So here's an example. It's a pretty simple deductive argument. Again, I'm using geometry because I think it's the easiest. Premise one is something like all triangles have 3 sides. And then we have a triangle. So I'm saying triangle is a triangle, but it is, you know, we could name it. Let's say the name is Walter. Walter is a triangle. So we know. The conclusion from premise 1 and premise 2 is then that Walter has 3 sides. Okay? Now we know that that's right. All triangles have 3 sides. Walter is a triangle. Therefore, Walter has 3 sides. That's just true by nature of the premises, how they connect. And if we know that those first 2 things are true, then not only is this a valid argument, but it's also a sound argument. So validity makes sure that the ideas connect together. Soundness makes sure that if the premises are true, then we have a sound argument. Okay. Now the upside. Why would you want to use deductive logic? We're talking about necessity here. If you can get a deductive argument to be valid and to be sound, it is impossible for anything in that argument to be false. That's really amazing. And that's the hope of math, right? Where if you've defined your numbers well, if you know how the operators work, addition, subtraction, etc., then no matter what you do to the numbers, whatever you conclude, it's going to be necessarily true. That's the attraction. It's really cool. And so you could see if philosophy or argumentation could do that, we could start with a bunch of ideas, and if we just use logic to work on those ideas, we end up with true conclusions that weren't obvious to us at the very beginning. We did logic on them, we got non-obvious outputs, and then because we did everything correctly, we get true stuff. So the upside is we get necessarily true stuff. But it turns out that the downside is, I put that this particular argument is not so exciting, but part of the reason for this is it's really, really, really difficult to find a domain of inquiry or of knowledge or of life where you can talk about stuff with absolute certainty, or you can talk about stuff as being necessarily true or something like that. That's why I say math and geometry. You basically have stipulations. You have stuff that does end up being true kind of by definition, and that's how you work on stuff. It doesn't work like that in most areas of life. Now, it'd be cool if we could find something akin to that, but we often can't. And for that reason, the second big type of reasoning or big type of argument is often called inductive logic. Inductive logic. So rather than deductive, it's inductive. Rather than top down, it's often called bottom up. Rather than necessity in deductive arguments, here we're talking about probability. Probability. So we aren't guaranteed truth here. It's not 100%. Here we're, maybe we're satisfied with 90% probability that this could be true. Okay? And the picture here is a bag of marbles. And so you could do this hypothetical thought experiment. Okay? So imagine you have a bag of marbles. And you pull out, like you don't know what color the marbles are on the inside. You pull out a marble and it's red. You pull out another marble and it's red. And as you're pulling out marbles, before you know it, you have 10 red marbles. So the question then is, what is the color of the marbles in the bag? Now, we don't know with absolute certainty until we take the marbles out of the bag. But as we pull out marbles and they continuously come up red, it seems as though that does kind of increase the probability that the the bag might be full of red marbles. Now it gets more complicated if we have multiple colors, and there's always a chance that, yeah, maybe we pulled out 99 marbles that are red, but the last marble ends up being black, okay? That could totally happen. So with inductive logic, we're only talking about probability. Nothing is guaranteed here. But this is much more akin to how we do stuff in life. So I say that, the examples here are something like observational sciences, something like statistics, just something like life, you could go to a restaurant and you could eat and it's a really delicious experience, and you go back again, it's a really delicious experience. But then you go back on a third night, maybe with one of your friends, you're like, I've gone here a couple of times, I think it's really amazing. And then you just happen to go on a night where it's off and it ends up not being as good, right? You did a good job of reasoning from some data that you had to a conclusion. Oh, it's been delicious every single time that I've been so far. Why wouldn't it be delicious in the future? But then those anomalous cases can sometimes happen, okay? So just in the same way that we assess deductive arguments for validity and soundness, how the pieces connect, and then whether the individual premises are true, same thing happens in inductive logic or inductive arguments, where instead of validity, we test for strength. And what strength here means that if the premises were true, then the conclusion would be highly probable. If the premises were true, then the conclusion would be highly probable. The ideas are connected in the right way. All right. Now, again, we can only talk about probability with inductive logic. And then instead of soundness, we have cogency. And cogency is strength. So the pieces connect in the right way. We have a really high probability of things being true if the premises are true. And then we look at all of the premises and they end up being true. So now we know that we have a high probability of truth in this particular case. So the strength, just like validity, you're evaluating the connections and you're saying, if I were just to grant to my opponent that these premises are true, then I think that their conclusion actually follows. Okay? And then in the second step, the cogency step, we are no longer just assuming that our opponent is right. We say, okay, the connections work, but now let's go premise by premise, sentence by sentence, and see if the sentences are actually true. Okay. So here's an example of an inductive argument. Premise 1, Blinding Lights by The Weeknd has 812 million views on YouTube for its official audio and 856 million views for its official video. Premise 2, Blinding Lights spent 90 weeks on the Billboard Hot 100. Premise 3, The Weeknd performed Blinding Lights at the 2021 Super Bowl. Conclusion, you have probably heard the song Blinding Lights by The Weeknd. Okay? So that's not an argument that's necessarily going to be true or false. Okay? It's not a deductive argument. But what I'm trying to do in the premises of this argument is to lead up to that conclusion that you've probably heard Blinding Lights. Like if somebody said that they've never heard Blinding Lights, basically the reasons that I'm using in this argument are like that's a really wild thing, because Blinding Lights has almost 1 billion views on its audio, almost 1 billion views on its video on YouTube. It spent over a year, almost 2 years on the Billboard Top 100. It was in the Super Bowl halftime performance. You haven't heard Blinding Lights, right? You haven't even heard a bar of it. And so this was my best attempt at making a strong argument. I think that those three premises, if they were true, it would basically make the conclusion really probable. And this is also just like a really simple attempt at cogency, where all three of those premises are true. I looked them up before I made this lecture. So if they're true and the premises connect, it makes a pretty high probability that you're probably a person who has heard this particular song. Now, this lecture might age differently. It might age badly as we move into the future. But for now, it seems like a pretty strong argument. And if it's not, then we would have to think about why the argument breaks down. Okay. But generally speaking, before we move on to this section, you should understand arguments are collections of statements. Every single argument has a conclusion or the point. It's what the arguer is trying to get you to believe. And every argument is going to have premises or proof or information that is supposed to support that conclusion. Everything is geared toward proving that particular point. That's what it means to be an argument. And generally speaking, we can have inductive and deductive arguments. But if you remember only two terms from the deductive and inductive arguments, remember that validity is about testing the connections between the premises and the conclusion. Validity just means that if the premises were true, the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. Soundness means that the argument is valid, so the premises are connected to the conclusion in the right way, and the premises are true. Okay, so validity is about the connections. Soundness says the connections are right, and actually every statement in the argument is actually true. So we should aim for valid arguments, and sound arguments would be even better if we could do that. But one thing that I wanted to get at in this particular lecture is that we shouldn't forget the arguer. So the traditional view can sometimes overemphasize in certain ways, and I don't think Baronet does this necessarily. Like, his textbook is really big, so he gets into some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about. But sometimes debate bros on the internet, they're just like, debate me. Why don't you want to have a rational conversation about something? One of the things we have to like realize, or if we're talking with someone who's like upset, or someone who feels threatened, some element of their identity is being challenged by an argument, we have to remember that arguments and words are spoken and thought by people. It's really, really, really important to remember audience, to remember what's going on. And so there's a couple of people who kind of like expand on these ideas. So for example, Michael Gilbert has this book here called Arguing with People. And then the next book is going to be by Robert Talisse and Scott Aiken, who have this book right here. But Michael Gilbert says this about arguments. He says, we need to distinguish between an argument, which is a thing, an object, or as we will say, a product, and an argument as an interaction, a dynamic exchange between two or more people, which we call a process. So what Gilbert is saying here is that there are multiple senses of the term argument. We can take that traditional view where we're looking at the product, we're looking at the words, we're looking at the ideas. But it's also really, really important to consider the process and how arguments often come out of a conversation between people where they're exchanging information, potentially proving each other right or wrong, and they're just trying to work through the ideas. This definition is even more inherent in what Scott Aiken and Robert Talisse say here. And they say arguments are, quote, any attempt to discover, discern, and evaluate reasons for belief or action. Any attempt to think things through, to talk things over, or to figure things out by means of a process aimed at sharing and evaluating reasons. And what I really like about this take on arguments is that, again, it emphasizes the social aspect. Yes, there are beliefs. Yes, we're trying to figure out what we should think or how we should act, and we're evaluating stuff, but it's in a social setting. We're talking things through. We're sharing information. We're evaluating stuff to see how stuff holds up, okay? And I think the point of this is something like dialectic. Now I'm going to use it in a relatively loose way. Some logicians, some rhetoricians, some communications people, they will have a much stricter definition. So there are many strict definitions, for example, like in Platonic philosophy or Hegelian philosophy or whatever else. But dialectic, broadly speaking, is coming from the Greek word dialektikos. And that's coming from the Greek word lego, which is about talking or maybe about sorting things out, and dia, which means through. So you can think of dialectic as something that happens through speech. We're using speech to kind of sort different ideas, to evaluate stuff, to argue. But here I don't mean argue in the sense of like purely combative, vindictive, maybe something like cross-examination in a criminal trial or anything like that. That's not what I'm talking about. But we're using language, we're using our reasons to sort through good and bad ideas. And again, the through language thing is, whenever we're talking, we're probably talking with other people. And given that we have other people that we're talking and thinking through, we need to keep in mind that we need to respect other people, and we should probably also expect some mistakes, right? Conversations very often have rules Whether implicit, we don't say them, we just kind of assume them, or explicit, we set them out. So a debate competition or court are really good examples of explicit rules in certain things. Because whenever we're talking, what we're trying to do is be as fair as possible. We're trying to create a smooth conversation. And ultimately, we're trying to give ourselves the best shot at discovering the truth of the matter, the best shot of figuring out what we should think, the best shot of figuring out what we should do in a given situation. But we can't do that if we don't respect one another. We can't do that if we can't figure out which ideas are strong and which ideas are not, how ideas should connect. And again, the future lessons are going to talk about more specific aspects, but this is what we're doing when we're doing logic. Now, generally speaking, this is whenever we start to study things called fallacies. And a fallacy, just in a very broad sense, is a mistake. So a fallacy in the context of our course is a mistake in the logic of the argument. Just some aspect of it that doesn't work. Now, two things or two subcategories of fallacies are often talked about. The first one is called formal fallacies. So these are mistakes that render the argument invalid. So in a deductive argument, it renders it invalid, or in an inductive argument, it renders it weak. So a formal fallacy is a mistake in the way that the ideas connect. Now, these tend to be pretty technical. If you take a logic class or multiple logic classes or discrete math, you'll find the formal fallacies, how stuff doesn't connect in the right way. Now, in this class, more relevant for our class, more relevant for rhetoric and stuff like that, is going to be informal fallacies. And these are going to be mistakes, not necessarily that will render an argument invalid, although invalidity is certainly coming from fallacies, but mistakes in reasoning or presentation that make the argument kind of less appealing or less effective. But think of fallacies as mistakes, and we'll talk about specific ones as the class moves forward. But I do want to say that, one of the limitations of human reason is that, like I said in the first video on definitions, we often can't say everything. We leave things unsaid. So there's a technical term that we need to have here, at least in our back pocket, called enthymeme. And what an enthymeme is it's an argument that's missing a premise or a conclusion or both. An enthymeme is an argument that's missing a premise, a conclusion, or both. So basically, in order to get the ideas to connect right, in order to arrive at that conclusion, you need extra statements that someone just didn't say. They just assumed that their audience knew. Or the arguer puts all of the pieces together, but they leave it up to the audience to figure out what the image on the puzzle is. Sometimes you can use it for rhetorical effect. You can leave things unsaid because, maybe it's awkward, or maybe you don't need to go there, or maybe you want your audience to connect the dots, right? If you have a little bit of suspense. Generally speaking, in logic, though, please don't do that. Please be explicit and say every single premise in the thing and say your conclusions. But in speeches, sometimes you don't do that. And whenever you don't say something, we would call this having a tacit premise or a tacit inclusion, or an implicit premise or a conclusion or an assumption. So basically this, whenever something is tacit, it means that it's not explicitly said. And in the context of our course, if we don't explicitly say it, the argument, technically speaking, is therefore rendered invalid, right? Because validity means that all of the pieces are there and they've all connected. If we have to add something, the argument as it originally was invalid. Now, we can add stuff, and I'm going to talk about that, but that's what it means for something to be tacit. An enthymeme means that something is missing, and usually it's missing because something is tacit. Something has been unsaid, okay? But in us not saying it, we technically have made an invalid argument, all right? And so here's an example. If you ever seen the movie Talladega Knights, Will Ferrell movies are one of my favorite things to watch. This is Talladega Nights, the Ballad of Ricky Bobby. Ricky Bobby is very famous for saying this: "If you ain't first, you're last. If you ain't first, you're last." And it's something that he lives by with his friend Cal, right? But the point is, like, okay, like we get it. We get the conclusion. We get the conclusion that Ricky Bobby is just going to aim after being number one. He never lets his friend win any races. He only lets his friend get second place because he lives by if you ain't first, you're last. The idea being that anything less than absolute perfection is basically complete and total failure. Okay. But that statement as it is, if you ain't first, you're last, has a lot of tacit ideas. We have to unpack it to get at the idea that, first place is the only thing that is successful, sorry. And anything other than first place is an utter failure. Of course, this is addressed in the movie. It's a really great comedy when Ricky Bobby has a conversation with his absentee and deadbeat father. Ricky Bobby says, "Wait, Dad, don't you remember the time you told me if you ain't first, you're last?" And Reese says, "Huh? What are you talking about, son?" Ricky says, "That day at school." And his dad says, "Oh, hell, son, I was high that day. That doesn't make any sense at all. You can be second, third, fourth. Hell, you can even be fifth." And then Ricky Bobby says, "What? I've lived my whole life by that." And so, to a certain extent, Ricky Bobby isn't to blame in the sense that he first heard this when he was like, I think in middle school, when he was really young, and his dad left and he really loved his dad. And so he wanted to live by what little wisdom he could remember that his dad taught him. If you ain't first, you're last. But as an adult, he is sort of realizing that mentality can kind of wreck his life. and his dad is kind of confirming that. So what his dad is doing is his dad is looking at the implicit or the tacit premises that have to be into that argument. The conclusion that Ricky Bobby is trying to get us to believe is that anything less than first place is a failure. Anything less than first place is last place. And his dad is saying that doesn't make any sense. There's actually a full spectrum of places, and success is actually widely varied, right? And so that is what we're doing when we're analyzing arguments. We're slowing down and we're trying to see if there's any missing pieces or if the pieces connect in the right ways. Okay? But it's tough to do this. It's tough to argue. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about some considerations about how we do this, how we do philosophy, how we do argumentation. And I'm going to rely heavily on the work of Dan Dennett. Daniel Dennett is a very famous philosopher, especially in the philosophy of mind. He's a very clear and interesting writer. This particular book, which is a pretty hefty book, it's still very accessible. It's called Intuition Pumps and Other Thinking Tools. He has some really interesting statements that are relevant for what we're talking about. So I'm gonna quote him a couple of times here. But Dennett, basically what he says, whenever we're doing philosophy, this is what he says, quote, "The middle ground, roughly halfway between poetry and mathematics, is where philosophers can make their best contributions, I believe, yielding genuine clarifications of deeply puzzling problems." Okay, so he sees philosophy as a middle ground between poetry and math that deals with really difficult questions and puzzles, but actually clarifies them to a certain extent. And so what I take this to mean is basically that whenever we're talking about really difficult and deep stuff, we should try to share the poet's curiosity. Poets are really curious about the world. They're really in tune with their experiences, how people are living. They're connected to life. And we should keep that. And we should also keep the mathematician's aspiration for being precise, for being clear. That's what mathematics tries to do. So whenever you mix the curiosity and the connectedness to life of poets, and you mix the precision and the clarity of a mathematician, that's kind of where you get philosophy if you apply that to really difficult questions. Questions about what kind of life should I live? How should we form our communities to be more just? What does it mean for something to be beautiful? Those really deep philosophical questions. We want to be attached to the stuff that people naturally wonder about, and we want to talk as clearly as possible, but it's really difficult because they're deep and difficult questions that humans have been talking about for thousands of years. Okay? But on the other hand, the reason why Dennett says that it's a middle ground is because he doesn't think that the methods of poets or the methods of mathematicians can work on these deep questions in all ways. Poets can sometimes use really difficult and obscure language. As we talked about last class with definitions, they can sometimes be ambiguous and vague. We don't want that aspect of poetry. We want their connectedness to life. We don't want their mysticism of language. Mathematicians, they can get stuff that can be necessarily true. They're really expert arguers or expert reasoners. But sometimes math is super abstract. We probably have never run into a1 or a plus or an exponent, right? These are symbols that kind of help us to understand everyday experience, but they're very abstract. So, as I said, we want to maintain that curiosity, that attachment to life, and we want to be as precise as possible. That's kind of what we want to do when we're doing philosophy. But it's hard to do this, and I just wanted to take some time to talk about these, because I think these are really invaluable things that should be on any educated person's radar. There's a couple of things here that have been named after people, because they're these curious thoughts that are fun to think about. One is called Hanlon's razor, and the idea here is never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. So basically, don't assume that someone is being evil or malicious, pernicious, insidious, that they're being bad, because chances are they're just being stupid. And stupid here meaning, like, in a lot of ways, when stuff goes wrong, it's very rare that someone is a bad person. It's usually that someone has just like messed something up in a stupid way. Okay. In arguments, the idea is if something is going south, maybe you're arguing with a bad person. That could be the case. We're going to talk a little bit about that. But it might also be the case that just like words are failing or the ideas are difficult, and we just need to be very, very careful before we just outright hate someone or call someone evil. We need to give them kind of benefit of the doubt. And then the second thing here is called Sturgeon's law. And Sturgeon's law is 90% of everything is crap. Sometimes 90% of everything is crud. And the idea that Sturgeon basically is trying to get at here is that whenever you're looking at anything, philosophy, movies, novels, food, there is a lot of stuff that is not up to par. It's not up to quality, okay? Not everything can be perfect in a given domain. Now that doesn't mean that it's that you don't do that. Like I'm not very good at video games. Like I'm really bad at video games, but that doesn't keep me from playing video games. I still like to do it, right? There's still value there. But here's why it matters. Whenever we're engaging in argumentation, we want to make sure that if we're attacking an argument, we're attacking the best of the best. Don't go after the weak arguments. Or if we're comparing examples between two rival theories or two cases, we should compare the best to the best and the worst to the worst. It's not that you can't talk about the bad stuff, you totally can, but you don't want to compare the worst of one case to the best of another. You don't want to compare, I don't know, a Dollar General cola to, I don't know, some sort of boutique Italian soda. That comparison just doesn't make sense. Maybe we can compare a McDonald's, freshly maintained soda machine at McDonald's, the Sprite that comes out of a McDonald's, to like Starry or something that we pick up somewhere else. We probably don't want to go top tier stuff to the bottom tier stuff. Bourbon is another really good example. You wouldn't want to compare the stuff that comes in a gallon with a handle, right, to the stuff that is like single batch, artisanally made by master distillers. Okay? Compare good to good, compare bad to bad. So Hanlon's razor, don't think that people are evil unless you have good reason for it, because if they're making things harder or they're not saying things in the right way, it's probably just there's limitations to what they're doing. Now, and similarly, there are a lot of mistakes. There's a lot of bad stuff out there. So try and go after the good, and try and, as much as possible, compare the good to the good and the bad to the bad. Don't cross between those. Okay. Now, part of this is related to how we make arguments. And Dennett, again, he's talking about this guy named Rappaport, who was very involved in economics and I guess somewhat abstractly problems that are related to computer programming. But Rappaport had some rules for making arguments, and this is especially whenever you're having, again, the argument with the person. You're not just dealing with the words, but we're trying to remember that arguments are made by arguers. And Rappaport has these 4 rules for when you should criticize. Rule number 1, you should attempt to re-express your target's position so clearly, vividly, and fairly that your target says, "Thanks, I wish I'd thought of putting it that way." So rule number 1 is just making sure that you understood your opponent. And the way that you make sure that you understood your opponent is you recharacterize their argument in a way that they would say, "Yeah, that's great," or Wow, I wish I had said it in that way. Number two, you should list any points of agreement, especially if they are not matters of general or widespread agreement. So, whenever you're dealing with an opponent, if you can acknowledge where you agree with them, that's a really good thing. And obviously, non-obvious stuff is even more important to acknowledge. This is related to number three. You should mention anything you have learned from your target. So give props, give dues where you can. Um, you probably have learned something, especially from someone who's smart, okay, or someone who's sensible or who's thought through things. And then rule number four is only then are you permitted to say so much as a word of rebuttal or of criticism. So the point of Rappaport's rules is to say that basically, before you criticize someone or before you really lay into an opponent, what you need to do is characterize their argument, re-summarize their argument in a way that they would agree that you've understood what's going on, acknowledge that you agree with them in some ways, acknowledge that you've learned something from them in some ways, and then you can lay into them. Now, Dennett is also a philosopher who is incredibly incisive. He will go in on people, all right? You can totally do that. You can be tough in argumentation. I'm not telling you to be a pushover. I'm not telling you not to criticize other people. Rather, what these rules are doing is they're saying you can criticize people, but you got to earn it. And you got to earn it by making sure that you're getting to the deep issues of what your opponent is talking about and that you have some basis for agreement. And that's really, really important. So it's more like hit this threshold, make sure that you've actually treated your opponent respectfully and taken their ideas seriously, and then you can criticize. That's what's going on here. Now, this is what's related very often in argumentation called the principle of charity. The principle of charity, and this is a very, very important idea. The principle of charity basically says, assume that your opponent is reasonable and wants to say true things. Meaning, don't assume that your opponent is an idiot, right? If they're an idiot, why are you arguing with them? So assume that your opponent is reasonable and wants to say true things. So interpret her arguments with care and benevolence. Care here meaning paying attention to the words, trying to get them right, trying to recharacterize them in a strong way, and benevolence in the sense of not being malicious, trying to be generous, trying to be graceful. If they've made a mistake, like a small mistake, go ahead and correct it. Okay, that's okay. So you're trying to take their ideas seriously. You're trying to give them benefit of the doubt. You're not just trying to skewer them on the smallest points. Okay. Now I have a big note here. I have a really big note here, and that is, this does not work on bad faith arguments. And bad faith arguments, I think, very often are characterized by arguments between people who don't think that they could be wrong. So if someone doesn't think that they could be wrong about a particular thing, that's a red flag. Similarly, people who don't want to change their mind, if they don't want to change their mind, that's also potentially bad. Then they're just giving you a sermon, right? That this is not an exchange of ideas, because the exchange of ideas is kind of part of what's going on. Whenever you're having a deep disagreement or a deep argument with someone, what makes it a good faith argument versus a bad faith one is that you're both coming to the argument. And even though you feel very strongly about your side, you're open to evidence. You're open to potential ways of being wrong. You're open to potentially changing your mind. Now, it might take a lot to get there, okay? But if someone says that they couldn't be wrong, or that they wouldn't ever change their mind, or that they're not interested in hearing any further information, you might be using language, but you're not using it to argue anymore. It's turned into something else, okay? So charity only works in good faith argumentation. Do not extend charity to someone who is doing something else with the language. Then you're just going to exhaust yourself. So basically what I'm saying here is to choose your battles. And what I find really funny about this is that Aristotle is writing about this over 2,000 years ago in one of his logical works called the Topics. And he says this. He says, quote, "Not every problem nor every thesis should be examined." Right? So you don't have to look at every single idea, but only one which might puzzle one of those who need arguments. So you only talk about the ideas that might be curious to someone who thinks through things. Okay? You don't talk about the ideas, for example, that need punishment or perception. Now he explains this. This is the blue text. For people who are puzzled to know whether one ought to honor the gods and love one's parents or not, need punishment. While those who are puzzled to know whether snow is white or not, need perception. So it's phrased a little confusingly here, but the idea is you don't have to argue with people who are wondering why you should respect your parents or why you should honor the gods. That's not an issue that you're going to be able to argue with someone over. That's an issue where you might have to go to extreme measures like punishment. Now, I don't know if those are the exact topics that we want to talk about, but the idea is if we're asking questions about whether we should respect a human being, I think Aristotle would say that's not indicative of you being a curious person and asking a question that needs to be debated over. That's an indication of potential failure in your moral education. Similarly, if you're arguing over whether snow is white or whether bourbon is brown or whatever else, that's not something that's going to be settled by further reasons, by further argumentation. That is something where someone needs more experience. They need to really pay attention to how they're perceiving things to just see the truth of certain things. Now, again, you could disagree with the specifics of this, but what Aristotle is saying here is not everything is up for argument. And you just have to be careful. As one of my professors once said, no need to play devil's advocate. He has enough advocates already. I think I rephrase that as please don't play devil's advocate. He has adequate representation. But the phrase of being a devil's advocate is the idea that you are arguing on behalf of the devil. That's what it means to be a devil's advocate. You are taking the devil's side and you are trying to present his case as clearly as possible. Now, devil's advocacy is not the same as representing an idea that you think you need fairly. But I think what Aristotle is saying here and what my remarks about being in a good faith argument are trying to say here is, yes, arguments have a conclusion and they have premises that support that conclusion. And we should, as much as possible, extend charity to our opponents and take their ideas seriously. But also, if the person is just being a jerk, if the person is just trying to argue about hypotheticals for the sake of some weird idea, you're not under any obligation to engage with that, especially if it's something that disrespects you or disrespects other people or just doesn't get what's going on. Okay, so one of the dangers of learning logic or critical thinking or rhetoric is kind of like the danger of learning martial arts. As soon as you learn how to throw a karate chop or throw a really good jab or a punch, suddenly you want to chop a lot of things or punch a lot of things, right? Same with logic and argumentation. As soon as you learn how speech works, as soon as you learn how arguments work, how fallacies work, you want to just point those out everywhere. And sometimes it's okay to point those things out, but other times you just kind of have to realize what's going on. And you don't want to use those powers for ill. And that's, I guess, what I'm trying to say here. But this is very much related to basically the last major point that I'm going to make in this presentation, which is a question of how far do we extend charity? So in these contexts where we're arguing with people who maybe aren't open to changing their minds, or they're arguing for really monstrous beliefs that we probably shouldn't be like taking any time to seriously consider, do we have to extend charity to them? And I think that the answer is basically no. But I want to phrase the problem slightly differently here. And the problem as I see it is that we often extend charity to ourselves and to our loved ones, maybe when we shouldn't. And we often extend criticism to opponents, maybe when we shouldn't. And so the warning here is about trying to avoid those two extremes. In the ways that we would basically try to re-explain our own ideas, or in the ways that if our friend was talking to us and it was unclear, we would ask for clarification and let them retry ideas or whatever. We want to, generally speaking, do that to opponents. Okay? And I think that the same is also true in ways that we might criticize opponents. We might also want to turn that back on our own ideas. Now, I'm not talking about, annihilating self-esteem or anything like that, but I'm saying in the realm of politics or ethics or law or, just anything where you're trying to figure stuff out, it's often a good reminder to be critical of your ideas and be more open to other people's ideas. Now, it depends on the person. I find that some people, and this can vary with socioeconomic stuff like gender or class or education or something like that. Some people are really, really, really self-critical. Not talking to those people, but generally speaking, it's good to be critical of ourselves. It's good to be sympathetic toward our audience. Now, this is related to a couple of fallacies, though, because I think there's something like a Goldilocks zone between these two fallacies that are talking about charity. Remember that charity is assuming that your opponent is a reasonable person who's trying to say true things, and you're approaching their argument with care and benevolence, okay? You're basically trying to interpret their argument in a reasonably strong way. Now, reasonably strong is a very vague term. It's not clear what that means. And I can't define it precisely, but I can give you these two mistakes as things to avoid, and probably saying that the truth is somewhere in the middle. So on the one hand, we don't want to commit what's often called the straw man fallacy. The straw man fallacy. The straw man fallacy is whenever we're interpreting an argument in a weak way so that it's easy to refute. Straw man is named after kind of like a scarecrow. Imagine wrestling a scarecrow. You're going to be able to beat that scarecrow up every single time. Now, it might look from a distance like you're wrestling a formidable opponent, but you're going to be able to defeat it. The straw man fallacy is basically whenever you look at an opponent's argument and you recount it in the silliest, most basic way possible so that you can take it down. A lot of online debates are kind of like this, or less online debates, more online monologues. Now, you can kind of get this to be in debate if you have someone who chooses to debate someone who's not an expert on a topic. That can be something similar related to this. But the straw man fallacy is whenever you just reduce your opponent's argument to the silliest thing possible so that you can refute it very, very easily. This happens all the time in politics, right? Think about any major issue. Think about how Republicans talk about Democrats. Think about how Democrats talk about Republicans. If it's a soundbite that fits into 3 words, chances are it's approaching something like a straw man. You're not getting at the deep issues. That's the problem with the straw man fallacy. It's a fallacy because if you don't get your opponent's argument wrong and you don't get to the substantive issues, whatever debate, whatever argument you're having, it's just not going to get to the point. It's not going to get to the issues. But on the other side, and this is less common, but it does still happen, is the Iron Man fallacy. The Iron Man fallacy. And this is the fallacy or the mistake of interpreting an argument so strongly that it's impossible to refute. Interpreting an argument so strongly that it's impossible to refute. So instead of wrestling a straw man that's easy to defeat, whenever you create an Iron Man, you're creating something that's unassailable, that there are no mistakes in. Now, if this were proper philosophy, it would be cool if you could create an argument in that way. But what makes this a fallacy is that it's probably not actually irrefutable. It's probably not so perfect. And also, we tend to Iron Man as opposed to straw man. We tend to straw man our opponents. We tend to Iron Man our friends or even ourselves. And so whenever we're talking about charity, basically what charity is it's reconstructing an argument. You have to let dumb ideas be dumb. Okay? I mean, like there's just no way around that. I've written dumb stuff. I've changed my mind on some stuff. I've changed political positions as I've gone through life and gotten older or whatever else. Sometimes my ideas were just bad. I think it's important to point that out to a certain extent. After charity, right? So you do let people make mistakes. So don't extend charity so much that you don't let dumb ideas be dumb, that you don't let people make mistakes. But also, don't strawman your opponent in the sense that you assume that everything that they say is going to be a mistake, that there's nothing that could be right in their argument, that there is nothing reasonable about that person, that there's nothing true in anything that they're saying. What charity means is that you're in that conversation with that person, you're having that dialogue, you're having that exchange of ideas, and you're representing their ideas with fidelity, with faithfulness, with truth. Not so strong that you just don't think that it could be assailed, but not so weak that you're not getting at the deep issues. That's the thing. That's what I mean by charity. So whenever we think about charity and it being assuming that your opponent is reasonable and reconstructing their argument in a strong way, we're trying to avoid straw manning and just assuming that they're stupid. And we're trying to avoid iron manning, especially with ourselves or our friends, to assume that our friends or ourselves could never make mistakes. That's kind of what we're trying to get at here. Okay? So, takeaway lessons. Arguments have a point, and they always have support for that point. So the point is the conclusion, the support is the premises. In deductive logic, validity evaluates how strongly the premises connect to the conclusions. An argument is valid if the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. An argument is valid if the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. An argument is sound if it's valid and all of the premises are true. Okay, so arguments have a point, the conclusion, and you lead up to that point with the premises. Arguments are made by people, and that can mean a lot of stuff, but people make mistakes. And so this is why charity is really, really important. Whenever you're arguing with good people, be charitable. Assume that they're reasonable. Assume that they want to say true things. And if it's a good faith argument, right, where people are open to changing their minds, they're open to learning new information, they're open to exchanging ideas, charity is really, really important. So hopefully this helps us to give some definitions of what it means to be an argument, right? And hopefully this gives us basically some norms, maybe some meta norms, some values that help us to treat our opponents with respect and argue well. But again, there's limits, right? There's limits. Make sure that it's a good faith sort of thing. Make sure that it's a topic that's worth debating, and get after stuff. So as we move throughout this course, we will gain specific labels, specific concepts, specific examples of fallacies and mistakes in argumentation and rhetoric, and then we'll get into some very specific issues as we move forward. So thank you for your attention. Have a good night.